Today's lesson is going to be about some of the basics of square roots and solving equations that require square roots. So when we start talking about the square root of 36, it's a basic, that's going to be 6. So we're going to be looking at problems like that, and then some special scenarios that are going to happen when you start introducing yourself to basic square roots. Today's lesson should be pretty easy and straightforward, and probably won't take us very long. So let's go ahead and get things set up here with our system. We're going to get the document camera turned on, and we're going to start taking a look at some examples that you're going to see on today's homework assignment. So we're going to shrink me here in the corner, and we're going to turn on the document camera. So over here, now that we're on the document camera, we're going to take a look at some very basic problems. We're going to start off with, like I said before, the square root of 36. Well, the square root of 36, we need to ask ourselves what number times itself is going to equal 36. Well, 6 times 6 equals 36, so the square root of 36 is 6. Okay. Now, if I start off with the square root of 36, and then I ask myself, okay, well, what is the square root then of negative 36? Well, the issue when we take the square root of a negative number is that you can't do it. 6 times 6 equaled 36, but the only way to get negative 36 is for one number to be positive, one number to be negative. So therefore, you cannot take the square root of a negative number. So the square root of negative 36, we're going to write, has no solution. It's something that we can't do. Now, while you can't have a negative sign inside a square root, you can have a negative in front of a square root. If I have the square root of 36 with a negative sign in front of it, I can take the square root of 36, and we know that that already equals 6, and then the negative sign that's in front is going to attach itself in front. Now this happens because I could have the square root of the square root of 36 embedded in some problem, and there would be a negative sign waiting in front of it. There's a symbol that we're going to introduce today, and it simply just means that there is a positive and a negative answer. So positive, negative. We call this plus or minus square root of 36. Well, again, just like before, this symbol is in front of the 36. So the square root of 36 is 6, and that plus or minus symbol goes in front. All that simply means is that there is a positive 6 and there is a negative 6 as an answer. Now this is going to be something that comes into play because of the fact that equations that have x squared is going to create two answers, and we'll talk about that in a moment. All right. As we continue to work through this, we then need to take our square root problems and we need to talk about how will we use these in an equation. If we think back to very basic equations, we can have a two-step equation that looks like this. Now, when we solved equations that looked like this, our goal was to get x alone. And we had a process where we would undo the plus 4 with a minus 4. Those would cancel each other out, leaving me with 2x equals 4. And then the final step to get x alone would be to divide by 2. So x equals 2. We're doing the inverse operations. The inverse of plus 4 was to subtract 4. And the inverse of multiplied by 2 was to divide by 2. Well, we're now going to have equations that have a squared in there. So if I go up here and I take a look at a problem, and we'll start very basic, x squared equals 25. If I think about what this means that there is some number that I multiply it by itself that equals 25. Well, if I think for a moment, 5 times 5 equals 25. Therefore, x equals 5. But we have to think outside the box, and we have to realize that there is another number that when I multiply it by itself equals 25. Negative 5 times negative 5 also equals 25. So there is a second answer, and that second answer is negative 5. How can we solve this in an equation? Well, you should already know the answer based on the example that we did above. Let's think for a moment if we're going to solve an equation. This is x squared, and I need to get x alone. Well, what is the opposite of squared? The opposite of squaring something is to take the square root. So up above, the opposite of plus 4 was minus 4. The opposite of times by 2 is divide by 2. Well, the opposite of squared is going to be to square root. Now whatever I do to one side of the equals, I have to do to the other. Now this is very important. This next step is key. When you put a square root symbol into an equation so that you can get x alone, you have to make sure to put the plus or minus symbol from before. So on this next line, the square root and the squared cancel out, and x is alone. And on this side, I have to make sure to put plus or minus 6. If we think up above, there were 2 answers. Well, when I'm solving the equation, I have to make sure that I put this symbol in here so that I know that there is a positive 6 and there is a negative 6. Okay? Now, let's go and take a look at what will be the most challenging problem in this section. I can have an equation that says 2x squared plus 4 equals 22. Now my goal is to get x alone. Well, I'm going to solve this like a multi-step equation, and I'm going to have inverse operations. So I'm going to start with the opposite of plus 4, and that's going to be to subtract 4. The plus 4 and the minus 4 cancel out. 2x squared comes down, equals comes straight down, and 22 minus 4 is 18. In a two-step equation, I undo addition subtraction first. I am now going to undo the multiplication. I'm going to save the exponent for last because I'm doing inverse operations, so I'm basically working with PEMDAS backwards. So I'm going to undo the times 2 by dividing by 2 on both sides. After I divide by 2 on both sides, I'm going to have x squared left equals 9. Well, when I have the x squared and equals 9, I have one final step to get x alone, and that is to do the opposite of squaring. And the opposite of squaring is to square root. So I'm going to square root both sides. And that's going to get x alone, and then don't forget, we put the square root symbol in this problem, so I'm going to get plus or minus 3. Now, if I wanted to check this answer, I can take my positive 3, and I can plug it all the way back in the beginning. I can take my negative 3, and I can plug it all the way back in at the beginning, and I can check my answer. One last scenario in this section will be an equation that looks like this. The final situation could be a problem like negative 3x squared equals 27. Well, for this problem here, we're going to start by dividing by negative 3. So we're going to undo the multiplication with division, and I get x squared equals, and 27 divided by negative 3 is negative 9. Now I have to get x alone. And to do the opposite of squaring, I will square root. Now when I square root both sides of the equation, something right here should jump out at you. If I look at this side of the equation, what have I created? I have created the square root of a negative number. And if you remember from the beginning of this lesson, you cannot have the square root of a negative number. So this final answer is x equals no solution. So if you are taking the square root of something that is positive, you're going to have two answers. X equals plus or minus the square root of that number. But if you're taking the square root of a negative number, when you're solving for x, you're going to have no solution. I hope that this lesson helped. If you have any questions, bring your questions to our next group Zoom meeting. Thank you. Have a great day.